Hello and welcome back everyone to the Disciple Making Podcast, where we're all about helping Christians become disciple makers. I'm your host, Brad Mann. Now normally on the podcast and where we have been going, if you've been tracking with us over the last number of weeks, is we've been exploring the foundations that we as disciples want to create and set up in our own lives, but also and particularly in the lives of those that we are discipling. We've been going through a collection of those things, of those foundations. But I need to share with you, and for some of you who are listening from around the world, you may not be aware of this, but this podcast comes out of a local church, comes out of my ministry in a local church. And as a local church, we're going through quite a challenging time at the moment. It's part of a leadership transition that we're in, and my week has really been filled in navigating that space. And for many of us at our church, our thought lives and our prayer lives have been filled as we've been navigating that space. And so I wanted to take a break this week from just carrying on with business as usual in the podcast and take a moment to speak into that space that we're in. So for those of you listening from other spaces and places, I apologize for that. I hope that if you want to keep listening, that God will give you something to take away from this. But this is a moment where I want to use the podcast, particularly for those who are in our church and who are also navigating the space. And I want to speak this week briefly, to be fair, about navigating difficult waters in relationships, which is ironic because our next and our final foundational pillar that we're going to look at in the podcast in the normal progression is actually relationships and how Jesus did everything through relationships. And our call is also to live in relationship with one another. So this week is not totally divorced from where we should normally be, but we're going to do some practical first before we do some theory and then lived experience. And I want to speak a little bit more pastorally. I want to speak into those spaces where deep, genuine relationships go through difficult times. And I'm going to do that simply. I'm just going to do it by reflecting on a passage that Paul gives us in Colossians chapter 3. We're not going to try and address this exhaustively. I'm not going to try and share best practice and major and significant things, but we're going to just reflect on this passage together where I think we're going to find some of the wisdom that God gives us to help us as we relate to one another and as we strengthen our relationships with one another in the midst of turbulence and in the midst of challenge. So we're going to go through Colossians chapter 3 from verses 5 to 16, and we're just going to pick them piece by piece as we go. Paul starts this way in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. He says, "So put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you." I'm reading from the NLT, by the way. And I just love how right in the beginning, Paul, he does this twofold thing. He's like, there's a recognition that needs to happen in our hearts. We need to be aware that there are sinful and there are earthly things that lurk within us. We all wrestle with these. None of us are immune to these things. And in relationships, it's often the wrestle we face is that we want to take the ground where we have none of those things. Call that the moral high ground. Right? I've been the offended or affronted party in this relationship. And Paul's starting place is that actually we need to recognize that each of us, all of us in our own hearts, have sinful earthly things that are lurking there. None of us are pure. And so we've got to start from that place. And then he gives us this responsibility. There's a recognition of our responsibility. And he starts very strongly. He says, put those things to death. We have to, by the Spirit, seek to master them. We can't allow ourselves to stew in them, to allow them to ferment in us, to allow them to take hold of us and to shift and to shape our thinking. We must be able to see them, recognize them, and put them to death by the Spirit. You can't do this in your own strength. It's got to be as the Lord helps you and as you turn to seek Him in His face. But Paul's call to us is put those things to death. Seek to master them in the Spirit. He then carries on. He says, have nothing to do with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, and evil desires. Don't be greedy, for a greedy person is an idolater, worshipping the things of this world. Because of these sins, the anger of God is coming. And you used to do these things when your life was still a part of this world. So here Paul lists a collection of things that he says are characteristics of those who don't yet know Jesus. Characteristics that would have described us before we knew Jesus. Now, these things don't really relate to the situation that we as a church are wrestling in at the moment. So I'm going to pass over them quite briefly, but let's just notice the clear warning that exists here. Right? Let's not totally pass over them. Paul says, have nothing to do with these things: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. These are part of the sinful earthly things that lurk in our souls. And Paul's call to us is to have nothing to do with them, to root them out of our lives, to work ruthlessly to eliminate them from your life. Your walk with Jesus, your love of Jesus and your love of others and your living out of his mission will be compromised if you allow sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed to lurk in your hearts. So Paul's call is have nothing to do with them. Ruthlessly eliminate them from your life. Verse 8. But now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, and dirty language. Don't lie to each other, for you have stripped off your old sinful nature and all of its wicked deeds. I think this verse is so helpful. These verses 8 and 9, so helpful. In relationships, these things that Paul lists here, they're like kryptonite. You just need to bring any of these things into your relationship and it can cause immense damage. And as I read this, I saw this picture of wildfires. And in Cape Town where I live, we occasionally have fires that really burn on our mountain. And maybe you have similar experiences. And when these fires burn, they move across from one area to the next, and everything kind of burns up in their wake. But there are often patches where stuff doesn't burn, the fire misses parts. And then as the firefighters are working on the current area of the blaze, an old area will suddenly burst back into flame. And it does that because there's a latent amount of heat that's simmering. It's either under the ground or it's inside the trunks of trees, and it hasn't kind of smoldered up, but suddenly it'll catch a light and burst forth, and a new fire point will start. And as I read these words, we can often, in a relationship gets damaged because there's an incident, because something happens that breaks trust or hurts you or does something that damages the relationship. There's this incident, and then these things, these emotions, they're like the flashpoints that exist in the background, and things move on, and then suddenly something flares up, and they will destroy any godly relationship that we try and have. If we do not get rid of anger and rage and malicious behavior and slander, if we lie to one another, if we use bad language about one another. And see, the thing is, the real wrestle with these things is that these emotions cloak themselves in righteousness. Now that sounds like a really weird thing to say, like how does rage cloak itself in righteousness? But often when we are really angry about something, there's a righteous anger that exists, and we feel right because we feel like we've been slighted, and because of that, it's right that we recognize and acknowledge that thing is wrong, and there's a temptation in us to feel that it's right to be angry about those things. The anger masquerades as righteousness. We can even be deceived into thinking that malicious behavior that we enter into is right. And so we do it in good conscience, but actually there's something in our heart that's not right. And so the behavior that we've actually engaged in is ungodly and unhelpful. These things so easily cloud the attitude of our heart. They often will proclaim to our offended heart justice, but they will bring division. And when our heart is in this space of righteous judgment, it becomes unassailable. We can never receive another perspective because our humility is gone. And we've assumed the place of rightness, and we can't allow anyone else to occupy that place. And so we're unable to recognize the actual issue that we're carrying. And so these things really are like kryptonite in a relationship. Paul carries on in verse 10. He says, put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like Him. in this new life, it doesn't matter if you are Jew or a Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, and He lives in all of us. Yes, I love this piece. I love this piece that Paul just turns it around here. So he's warned us from verses 5 through to 9. He's warned us, get rid of this, put away this, deal with this. And now he says, this is what I want you to do positively. I want you to put on the new nature. I love this dual action that he speaks about here. He says there's our responsibility. Our responsibility is to choose to put on the new nature, to choose to engage in another way. And he's going to unpack a little bit what that looks like for us in the next couple of verses. But he says, as you choose to be different, as you choose to put away that former stuff and choose to engage like God wants you to, then God renews us and makes us more like Jesus. Isn't that beautiful? As we choose to be obedient to Him and follow Him, He comes and works in us and accentuates that change. And then don't you love this, how Paul uses these racial and class structures here to show the equality that we all have in Jesus. And so when we talk about relationships and relationships navigating difficult waters, Paul's saying it doesn't matter if you are the offended or you are the offender. If someone has hurt you or if you've hurt someone, and in most cases it's usually both, he says all that matters is Jesus. And you need to remember that He lives in your brother or your sister who offended you, who hurt you, in what they said or what they did. If they know and love Jesus, and they may have gotten it wrong, just like you may have gotten it wrong, that's not what's important. What's important is that God lives in them. That's what's important. And so he carries on in verse 12 and he says, since God chose you to be the holy people that He loves and is in, by the way, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I just love this. I really love this. Just take a moment to appreciate each of these ideas in light of a fractured relationship. When your relationship is damaged, what does it look like to engage with tender-hearted mercy? What does it mean to start off by being tender-hearted towards the person that has been estranged from you? Can you appreciate their point of view? Can you appreciate what they're going through? Can you empathize with them? Can you start there? Can you see your words through their eyes? Can you show them mercy? Can you withhold judgment and punishment to listen, to appreciate, to understand, to care? Can you show kindness? Can you treat them as though they're not your enemy but your brother or your sister? Can you show kindness to them in the way in which you relate to them? Can you put aside what may be deeply formal procedures and treat them in love? What does that look like? What does it look like to show real humility in this space? Are you willing to concede that maybe you played a role in whatever the fallout might have been? Are you willing to concede that it's not totally one-sided? Are you willing to concede that maybe there is a place where you could grow, you could learn, you may have done something wrong? Genuinely. Are you willing to remove the cloak of righteousness that anger shields? Are you able to be gentle instead of harsh? Because that's the God we serve. He is gentle and humble in heart. Are you able to be patient? Sometimes dealing with damaged relationships takes time. It can't happen in a day. It can't happen in a moment. Sometimes it takes time for people to see your point of view. Sometimes it takes time for you to see their point of view. Sometimes it takes time for our hearts to mend and to deal with the stuff that we need to get rid of. Can you have patience? Verse 13. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Again, I just love in this passage. Paul just sets this baseline for us that I think is so helpful. He says, friends, remember, we are all imperfect, so make allowance for one another's faults. Forgive a brother or sister when they offend you. Forgive them. Remember that they're not perfect. Even if you've really looked up to them, if you've loved them, if you've respected them, you've trusted them, they might disappoint you. Forgive them if they've offended you. Make allowance for their faults because they, just like you, are imperfect, and God forgave you in your imperfection just as He forgave me in my imperfection. And so I'm going to choose to forgive my brother or my sister in their imperfection. And I'm not going to forgive them contingent on their acknowledging their fault. I'm not going to do that because that holds me in slavery to their decision, their ability to deal with their stuff. I'm going to choose to forgive them, not because they've repented, but because God forgave me. Above all, verse 14, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony. And let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body you are called to live in peace, and always be thankful. This is the key. Love is the key. What does love look like when trust is broken? One of the things I've been aware of recently as we've been processing challenging times as a church family is, will we let a relationship be defined by a moment? Or will we look and allow it to be defined by character? Will we love beyond a moment? Will we love the person made in the image of God, whatever they may have done to us? Will we love them deeply and truly? Paul's promise is that when we do that, the peace that comes from Christ rules in our hearts. And we as members of one body are called to live in peace, and we can only do that in love. We can only do that when we truly, truly love one another, sacrificially, deeply, meaningfully, not just emotionally. Sometimes our emotions have to catch up, but love is a choice that we make. Be thankful. In the midst of what's going on, be thankful to the Lord. Paul carries on. He says, let the message about Christ and all its richness fill your lives. Teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom that He gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. I love this too. When in doubt, go back to Jesus. When in doubt, help one another, go back to Jesus. Be thankful to God for all He has done. Even though there's much to mourn, there's much to process and to deal with, be thankful to God for all that He has done. Think on Jesus. Think on His message. Think on His life. Teach and counsel one another with the wisdom that He gives. Speak life to one another out of the life of Jesus. And worship the Lord. Whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through Him to God the Father. Such a beautiful closer. Whatever you do, whatever you say, you're speaking on behalf of Jesus. It's a great standard to hold ourselves to. As you're sitting in relationships that are strained and it's challenging and it's hard, how do you make sure that each word that you speak is worthy of Jesus? That each thing that you do is worthy of Jesus? If we're at least asking ourselves that question, we put ourselves in a much better place to navigate those waters. So thank you so much for sticking around all the way through to here. I'm going to leave it there for today. It's been a little different. But my hope and my prayer is that in these reflections, God will help us navigate through the difficult waters that we sometimes encounter in relationships. And that we would be able to really honor Him, and that we'd be able to really honor each other as we navigate those challenges. God bless you, and may He give you grace for this week ahead. We'll be back to normal from next week. Ciao for now. Bye-bye.